Today I want to show the formula firewall error inside Power Query and two methods to solve it. In this case I want to have a cell where the user can input a file path. In this case it's to a folder, and then I want to extract a file from within this. And the important bit here is that I've named it my file path, because Power Query needs to either have a table or a named range in order to understand how to grab the information. This can be relevant if you need to swap between locations. Maybe you want to work on files on your local drive, or you need to change locations in case of maybe a task being moved to a different team. So this allows some variability. I go back into data and say I want to load from table, and this is Excel 2016, so it doesn't say from table or named range, but it's the same thing. And this is then called my file path because that's the name of the named range. I don't want these extra steps, so I'll remove them. And this gives me the source, where I then want to extract this text. So right now it's a 1 row, 1 column table, and I'll say I want to go into the 0th row, which gives me a record, and then I can go into column 1. And all this does is grab me the single value, which I already have here, so I can confirm it. What I want now is to use the output of this query as my input in another query. If I try to make a new query from a workbook, which I've already grabbed here, let's just say I want to grab the table. And right now it doesn't give me an error because of course this is a fixed path, which is coming from outside of my variable here. But because my variable has the start here, because I assume the ending, the name of the file, will be constant, I want this part to be variable. I can go into source and say instead of this double iteration, I want this instead to refer to the output of my query. And again, I'm in Excel 2016, so I don't have access to IntelliSense, meaning I have to write everything myself. It'll now immediately give me this formula firewall error. Usually I don't get this error right away. It will work, and then when I open the file again in the future, it'll stop working, or someone else uses it, it'll stop. And it's simply saying that my query references other queries or steps, and it doesn't like that because it doesn't know, maybe if someone went and manipulated this, my file path, something would break. So it's trying to protect me from nefarious people, which is fair, but it's kind of annoying because I want it to work this way. So I have two solutions to them, and I'm going to start out by making a group because there are different ways to do it. And the simple way to do it is that instead of actually using this query, I instead use the code from in here. So if I say again, I make a new query, I want to grab a workbook, and that was this one. And here where it gives me this fixed file path, if I just add some indentation here, I don't want this part, I wanted that to be variable. So I'll say that I want this to actually go into this my file path within my current workbook, grab the contents, grab row 0, grab column 1, and it will work. This code will do exactly what I want, but of course this can be very tricky to understand if you don't know exactly what's going on. Like I know it's very simple that I'm just saying this is a named range and I just want to extract the 0th row and the 1 value, which is very easy when you then go and find it inside the sheet and I can see, hey, that makes a lot of sense. My file path is one cell. But it can be confusing if you're not used to really working with Power Query, or maybe you're used to only doing stuff with the GUI. Another solution, which is the one I would use most of the time, which is where I'm just going to duplicate this. Instead of having this code here, I want to visualize what this does. And I can do this by adding a step, but of course that step has to run before the source step. And natively you can't add a step before source. I'm not able to drag it up before source, I can drag it below. But since I need named range inside of my source step, I need to load the named range before. And I can do this by going into Advanced Editor, which again can be intimidating to look at. But all I need to do is to add a new step for source, which I will just call my file path. And I'm choosing to call it the same thing as my named range, which is the same thing as my query, which will make sense in a moment. I'm going to say, go into the current workbook, inside my file path, extract this. And then Power Query is nice enough to tell me I forgot a comma. And I'm not going to change the actual source step yet, because I think it will make more sense to see it. So the benefit of this method is that I can now go in and actually see, well, what is the output of this code, because I can visualize it here. So when I go into source, I don't want this, I want my file path again. And Power Query is smart enough to understand that when I refer to my file path, I'm referring to the step. So in other words, it's looking at the local scope. It's first saying, can I find a step within my current query which has this name, which it can, and if it couldn't, it would try to grab this value, which would give me the firewall error. Meaning the benefit of this method is that you can go up here before source and say, well, what am I trying to get? And it then shows it here. And you might have a more complicated query to grab a file path, and you might need multiple steps. And you could do what I'm going to show in video 59, where you use a more complicated query and load it in one step. And then the benefit would be that you could go into my file path, the query, and look at the individual steps. You might need to extract, say, a month name from this file path, and maybe you need to say, instead of January, it needs to be 01 space dash space January. Or maybe you need to have the user be able to switch between SharePoint and a local drive. So you could have this query with multiple steps and then copy that in here and have that as the output of this file. To show how to do that, I'm just going to duplicate this and then say, instead of doing this, I want to instead say, go into this query, go into advanced editor and copy everything, including the let and in. And again, it doesn't really make sense when the query is this simple, but I would now say this, let the source keyword equal this thing, and then output source. So even though it's saying that the step is source, it's actually the source step within the query within this step. So it's a bit complicated. And especially if you go into advanced editor, it gets weird because now you have this let and source and in, but you also have let and in here. And in this situation, it's not necessary, but I wanted to include it for illustration purposes. My other solution to the firewall problem is that instead here, where I'm grabbing a text value and then I want to read this as part of my source, which is what I'm doing here, and it's saying no, 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 you can't do that, because here I'm trying to access the file contents of a partial file. What I can do instead is that I do have a source type called folder, which I'm just going to select this, and then I can change it afterwards, because I don't want this to be hard-coded here. What I can do instead is that I have this folder files and I have a file path, but this is an absolute file path, and I do want that variable from here. So I can grab this code and add that as a step before the source. So I would call that my file path again to be consistent, and then the comma. And I now have the file path just as before, and I can then say I want to use my file path as a file path inside this folder.files function, which gives me the exact same thing, except this is now variable. And then I don't want to call it this, I would call this my file path, but it's not grabbing just the file path, it's grabbing the folder from within, which means I now have access to the whole folder just as before. In these queries, I was navigating towards the file path, that is the folder, and then from that folder, I want to go into this data and output file. So what I can do now is that I want to reference this, because now this is my query, and here I'm allowed to reference, which is what I want to do in the end. So if we say solution wrong, what I can do is I'll start out by applying a filter, and since I don't have a lot of files, I can just find it manually and right click and say text filter equals, and then I want to extract the binary here. The reason why I call it wrong is that it's now doing all of this hard coding values, which I don't want. I specifically don't want anything to be hard coded, but it does it anyway. And again, this is hard coded, so I don't want that solution. Instead, I want to duplicate this. And of course, I could go in and then rewrite it, but I don't like the way it does this. Instead, I'll say I go into my file path folder, and actually I don't even need that step. So again, I can go in here and copy the code, because when it comes to Power Query, it's usually easier to get the code and then go back and replace it. I don't need to go into the whole folder. I can just reference the file path folder and say, from this table, I only want to return this one row. And now I need to do a little bit of cheating and say that I want to write something manually just because it's easier. Because this content folder has the file that I need to extract. I want to say Excel.Workbook, which is the function you get when you go in and say new source file, Excel.Workbook. And then, well, where am I getting it from? The table is called source. I'm going into row 0. And here you need to make sure you don't have any duplicates, which is kind of your job to make sure that people use the names correctly. And then go into the content column. And I could have this as an intermediary step, but I think it's confusing to look at. So all this is saying is, well, go into the one row, go into this column, and this returns a file. And then I want to treat this as an Excel file because it is an Excel file, and then it returns it. And then I should be where I am here. Now I have the same output, and then I can navigate into the table. So that was table, and now I have the same output as these. Both solutions work, and they basically have the same amount of steps. You should choose the one that you think makes most sense. In this case, where I have something super simple, which is just reading an entire file path from a cell, I would usually use this method because I have a step before the source, which makes it apparent that I'm using this for the source. Otherwise, it wouldn't be before the source. And I have the benefit of being able to visualize, well, what is the file path? It is exactly this. And then I go down in source and say, well, I'm actually adding something to the file path. I'm saying specifically go into data and output. And you could also make this a step right before source so that you could go in and manually type it. But this should be a constant, and the file path can be variable, which is based on what you input there. In this case, because it is so simple, my query, I don't need multiple steps, which is where I'd want to use this method, because I can then always say, well, you should go back to my file path to show all the steps. In cases where you want to go into the whole I would use this method with the My File Path folder in case you need to grab multiple files from within the same folder, because then this is a bit more intuitive to say, well, because I'm using the same folder all of the time, I can go in here and check information like when was it modified and when was it created. But personally, I would definitely use the 1-2 solution of having the step because I don't think this really adds much more understanding, but it always depends on what you think makes most sense. So that was it. Yep.